There are men who reject a woman because they do not love her. And then there are men who reject her because loving her scares them more than death. Dante Moretti was the most feared mafia boss in Chicago, a man who could move money, silence enemies, and bend powerful people with one quiet phone call. But every time Evelyn Hart came close to him, he pushed her away. He told himself it was protection. He told himself she would be safer without him. Then one night, she walked into his family's gala on the arm of his best friend, Gabriel Rossi, and for the first time in years, Dante Moretti could not move. This channel doesn't tell crime stories just for violence or shock. This channel tells stories about power, discipline, loyalty, and the hidden cost of becoming untouchable. Tonight's story is about a man who had everything except the courage to tell the truth, and a woman who finally learned that love should never ask her to lose her dignity. Watch until the end, because the real question is not who Evelyn chooses. The real question is whether a man who hurt her in the name of protection deserves a second chance. If this story pulls you in, leave a like. Share it with someone who understands complicated love, and subscribe for more mafia boss stories with heart, power, and consequences.
Rain had a way of making Chicago look honest. It washed the shine off the glass towers, blurred the headlights along the river, and turned every sidewalk into a mirror for people who did not want to look too closely at themselves. Evelyn Hart stood beneath the black awning of Bella Vita, one of the most expensive Italian restaurants in the city, holding an old hospital bill inside a manila envelope and wondering whether she was about to thank a dangerous man or accuse him. The restaurant was closed to the public that night. A private dinner was being held inside, the kind where judges, union leaders, businessmen, and men, with no official titles, all sat at the same white-clothed tables and pretended the city ran on laws alone. Evelyn knew enough about Chicago to know better. Some doors opened because a person had money, some opened because a person had power, and some opened because Dante Moretti allowed them to. She had never met him face to face. She had heard his name, of course. Everyone who worked around financial fraud, union contracts, construction bids, or warehouse routes had heard his name sooner or later. Dante Moretti was not the kind of man people called a criminal in public. They called him a businessman. Owner, a difficult man, a private man, a man who owned half the routes trucks used before sunrise, and probably knew who owed money before the debtor did. Evelyn had spent 3 weeks following a trail that should not have existed. Her mother's medical bills had been paid years ago through a charity that looked real, until Evelyn looked too closely. The address led to a law office. The law office led to a holding company. The holding company led through 3 more names, 2 dead accountants, and finally, quietly, to Moretti Logistics, to Dante Moretti. Her mother had cried when Evelyn asked about it, not because she knew the truth, but because she did not. "I thought it was a blessing," her mother had said. "After your father died, I stopped asking questions about blessings. That was what brought Evelyn here." Greed, not gratitude, not fear, questions. A man in a dark coat opened the front door before she knocked. He looked at her face, then at the envelope in her hand, then spoke into an earpiece so quietly she could not hear the words. A moment later, he stepped aside. "Miss Hart," he said. She did not ask how he knew her name. Men like Dante Moretti did not let strangers reach the door unless he already knew they were coming. Inside, the restaurant smelled like garlic, old wine, polished wood, and money. Soft music played somewhere near the bar. The main dining room had been cleared of most guests, though a few men lingered near the far wall, speaking in low voices. They turned as Evelyn entered, not with curiosity exactly, but with calculation. Kept walking. The man in the dark coat led her past the bar, down a short hallway, and into a private dining room with 1 round table, 2 leather chairs, and a window facing the wet street. Dante Moretti stood near that window with his back partly turned, one hand in the pocket of his black suit pants, the other holding a glass of water he did not drink. He was older than Evelyn expected, but not old. Mid-40s, maybe. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched lightly with gray at the temples. His suit looked simple until a person looked twice and realized nothing about it was simple. His face was calm in a way that did not invite comfort. He had the stillness of a man who never needed to hurry because other people hurried for him. He turned when she entered. For 1 second, Evelyn forgot the speech she had practiced in her car. Dante Moretti did not look surprised to see her. That bothered her more than if he had. "Miss Hart," he said. Voice was low, controlled, almost gentle. "You should have called first. I wasn't sure you'd answer." "I would have," she looked at him. "Would you have told me the truth?" Something moved behind his eyes, so quick she almost missed it. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit down, I'd rather stand." "Most people say that the first time." "I'm not most people." "No," he said. I know the words were quiet, but they carried weight. Evelyn felt anger rise in her chest. Not hot and wild, but sharp and clean. She placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward him. "My mother's hospital bills," she said. 7 years of payments. A charity that doesn't really exist. 3 shell companies. 1 law office. And at the end of the line, you. Daunt glanced at the envelope but did not touch it. "Mother needed care. That is an answer. It is the only one that matters." "No," Evelyn said. "It's the one that lets you avoid the rest." For the first time, Dante looked directly at her without the polite distance he had worn since she walked in. His eyes were dark, steady, and far more tired than his reputation allowed. "Your father once did something decent for me," he said. "I paid a debt." The mention of her father changed the room. Evelyn had been 10 when Thomas Hart died. "A car accident," the report said. "Bad weather, bad road, bad luck." Later, there had been whispers about missing pension money, about records that didn't add up, about her father having questions he should not have asked. Her mother never believed the whispers. Evelyn never had either. She took a slow breath. "What did my father do for you?" Dante's jaw tightened. "He told me the truth when everyone else was still making money from lies." That answer should have satisfied part of her. "It did not. You knew him, yes. You knew my father. And you let my mother believe some anonymous charity saved her life. I did not want her owing me gratitude, but you wanted control." The words came out before Evelyn could soften them. She did not regret them. Daunt set the glass down on the table. The sound was small, but every man outside the room seemed to go quieter. "You should be careful with accusations," he said. "I usually am, and tonight?" "Tonight I am tired." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things neither of them had permission to say yet. Dante studied her as though she were a document, written in a language he once knew, but had refused to speak for years. Evelyn felt his attention like heat on her skin. She had expected menace from him. She had prepared for arrogance, evasion, maybe even a threat dressed as advice. Not prepared for sadness. It was there, buried deep, but visible if a person knew how to read what men tried to hide. Evelyn had spent her career reading hidden things: false numbers, missing signatures, inflated invoices, grief tucked between ordinary sentences. Dante Moretti was better guarded than any ledger she had ever opened, but even he had seams. "You don't look like a man paying a debt," she said softly. "You look like a man keeping a promise that still hurts." Dante's expression did not change, but his hand, resting near the glass, closed once. That was how Evelyn knew she had touched something real. "You came here for answers," he said. "Yes. I gave you the answer you need." "No. You gave me the answer that keeps me at the edge of the room. That is where you should stay." The words should have made her angry. They did, but beneath the anger was something else. Disappointment. Because for one foolish moment, when his hand closed and his eyes darkened, she had thought he might finally choose honesty. Evelyn looked down at the envelope, then back at him. "I didn't come here to ask for money, I know. I didn't come here because I am impressed by your name. I know that too. Then, why do you keep talking to me like I'm someone who wandered into danger by accident?" Dant walked around the table, stopping several feet from her, close enough that she could see the faint scar near his left eyebrow. Far enough that the distance felt deliberate. "Because danger does not care whether you arrive by accident," he said. "It only cares that you arrived." Evelyn held his gaze. "And you think you read the danger?" A humorless smile touched his mouth and vanished. I am one of many. Maybe I want to decide that for myself. No, it was not loud, it was not cruel, but it landed harder than a shout. Evelyn stared at him. No, no, Dante said. Curiosity is safe from a distance. Stay there. That was the first time Dante Moretti rejected her. With hatred, not with indifference, with something worse restraint. For a moment, Evelyn said nothing. Rain tapped against the window behind him. Somewhere inside the room, a man cleared his throat and pretended not to listen. At last, she picked up the envelope and held it against her chest. My mother taught me to thank people when they help, she said. So thank you for what you did for her. Dante gave a single nod, but my father taught me something else, she continued. When a man gives you half an answer, look for the half he buried. Dante's eyes sharpened. Evelyn turned toward the door. Miss Hart, she stopped, but did not turn around. This alone, there it was. Not advice, not a request, a warning. Evelyn looked back at him over her shoulder. You don't know me well enough to tell me what to leave alone. Then she walked out. The hallway felt longer on the way back. The men near the bar watched her pass, but no one stopped her. The man in the dark coat opened the front door, and the cold rain hit her face like a slap. She stepped onto the sidewalk, breathing harder than she wanted to admit. Behind her, through the restaurant window, Dante stood exactly where she had left him. He did not follow. He did not call her back. He only watched. Inside the private dining room, Gabriel Rossi entered quietly a minute later. He had known Dante since they were boys. He knew when to speak and when silence was safer. Tonight, he chose to speak. Was that necessary? Gabriel asked. Dante kept his eyes on the rain outside. No. Then why do it? Dante watched Evelyn's figure disappear down the sidewalk. Because it was safer. Gabriel looked at his oldest friend with something close to pity. Those are not always the same thing. Dante said nothing. Outside, Evelyn reached her car, sat behind the wheel, and gripped it with both hands until the shaking stopped. She told herself it was anger. She told herself it was the cold. She did not tell herself the truth yet, that even after the warning, even after the rejection, some part of her still wanted to know why Moretti looked like a man who had just saved her from a fire by locking her outside in the rain. Evelyn Hart told herself she would not go back to Bella Vita. She told herself that one conversation with Dante Moretti was enough to confirm what every sensible person already knew. Powerful men did not hide answers because they were harmless. They hid them because the truth had teeth. For 3 days after that rainy night, she kept the manila envelope in the bottom drawer of her desk beneath tax records, client notes, and an old photograph of her father, holding her on his shoulders at a 4th of July picnic. She worked around it. She ignored it. She pretended the envelope had become ordinary paper again. But every time she opened that drawer, the past looked back at her. By Friday morning, she had stopped pretending. Her office sat on the 7th floor of an old brick building near the river, the kind of place that had been renovated just enough to attract small firms, but not enough to erase its history. The floors still creaked. The radiator still knocked in winter. The elevator still paused between floors as if reconsidering its purpose in life. Evelyn liked it that way. Buildings made people feel important. Old buildings reminded them they were temporary. She spread the hospital records across her desk beside the documents she had gathered on the old Union pension fund. Names repeated, not openly, never that carelessly. But names had shadows, and Evelyn had built a career tracing shadows. Moretti Logistics appeared nowhere on the main filings, but two subcontractors tied to the fund had once shared legal counsel with the company Dante controlled. Another had changed ownership 3 months after her father died. A fourth had been dissolved the same week a pension audit disappeared from public record. None of it proved anything, but it leaned. That was what Evelyn hated most about dirty money. It rarely stood in the open and confessed. Leaned, one quiet connection at a time, until the whole wall started to tilt. Near noon, her phone buzzed, unknown number. She stared at it for 2 rings before answering. Miss Hart, a male voice said, Mr. Morty would like to know if you have reconsidered his advice. Evelyn looked out the window at the gray city from beyond the glass. Does Mr. Morty always send other people to ask questions he does? Want answer to pause. He was clear that you should leave the matter alone. That was he an answer to my question. Another pause. This one shorter, irritated. You removing through records that involve people who do not enjoy attention. Most people stealing pension money don't tea. The line went quiet. Evelyn knew she should have felt fear. Normal person probably would have, but fear in Evelyn rarely arrived first. First came focus, then anger. Fear came later, usually when she was home alone and the lights were off. The man said, "You were warned." "No," she said. Advised, there is a difference. Yes, advice is something I can ignore. She ended the call before he could reply. For the rest of the day, she told herself she had handled it well. She made coffee, she reviewed ledgers. She highlighted inconsistencies in pension disbursement reports. She emailed a retired benefits administrator who might remember her father. She worked until the office building thinned out around her, until the law firm across the hall turned off its lights, until the cleaning crew pushed a cart past her door and asked if she was planning to sleep there. 9:43 p.m., Evelyn finally packed her bag and left. The parking garage below the building smelled of oil, wet concrete, and old exhaust. Her heels clicked against the floor in a rhythm too loud for the hour. She unlocked her car, slid behind the wheel, and turned the key. Nothing happened. She tried again. The engine clicked once, then died. Evelyn closed her eyes, of course. She checked the battery light, then the dashboard, then tried one more time. Still nothing. For a moment, she sat in the dim garage with both hands on the wheel, listening to the fluorescent lights buzz overhead. She reached for her phone to call a tow service. Before she could dial, headlights swept across the concrete. A black sedan rolled slowly into the garage and stopped 3 spaces away. Evelyn did not move. The rear door opened. Dante Moretti stepped out. He wore a dark overcoat over a charcoal suit, as if bad weather and late hours had no authority over him. Behind him, a driver remained near the car, hands folded, eyes forward. Dante looked at Evelyn as dead car, then at her. "You need a mechanic," he said. Evelyn got out slowly, leaving the car door open. "That's funny. I was just about to call one before Chicago's most inconvenient guardian angel appeared." His expression did not change. "I was nearby." "No, you weren't." A beat passed. "No," he admitted. "I was teat." Evelyn laughed once without humor. "At least we retrying honesty tonight." Dante looked toward the exit ramp, then back at her. The car was tampered with. The air seemed to cool around her. "How do you know that?" "Because my driver checked it before I came down." "Your driver checked my car?" "Yes." "Before you came down?" "Yes." She took a step toward him. "Which means your people were already here." Dante did not deny it. Evelyn felt the anger rise again, sharper this time, because fear was underneath it. "You had someone watching me. I had not watching the people watching you. That is not the comforting distinction you think it is. It was not meant to comfort you." "No, of course not. Comfort would require you to treat me like a person instead of a situation." Something crossed his face then. Not guilt exactly. He was too controlled for that. But the words reached him. He said, "You received a call today." Evelyn folded her arms. "Do you listen to those too?" "No." "Should I believe that?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because if I were lying, I would have chosen something more useful." She hated the answer sounded like him. Worse, she hated that she believed it. Dante stepped closer, but not too close. He understood space, the way dangerous men understood exits. "A man who called you does not work for me." "Then, who does he work for?" "A man who prefers old habits." "That is beautifully vague. It is safer than being specific in a parking garage." "As that word again," she said. "Safe." Dante was silent. The driver finished speaking with the mechanic on the phone and nodded once. Dante acknowledged him with barely a glance. Evelyn watched the exchange. "You do realize this is exactly the problem, don't you?" "What is?" "You keep appearing in moments like this. You fix the car, you scare off the threat, you know more than you say, and then you expect me to be grateful enough not to ask why. I expect you to live. That's not the same as respecting me." Dante's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger, but in attention, she continued, "because stopping now would feel like surrender." "Why do you always show up like you care, then talk like you don't? The question landed between them harder than she expected. For several seconds, Dan said nothing. Somewhere above them, a car crossed the street with a low rumble. Water dripped from a pipe near the far wall, slow and steady. At last, he said, because caring is not permission. Evelyn stared at him. It was the kind of sentence that sounded noble if a person did not examine it too closely. But Evelyn examined everything too closely. That was her gift and her curse. No, she said quietly, but it is also not a prison. His jaw tightened. The mechanic arrived 20 minutes later. Dante's driver handled the conversation. Evelyn stood beside her car, while Dant waited a few steps away, making no phone calls, giving no visible orders, simply occupying the garage with the stillness of a man other people arranged themselves around. When the mechanic confirmed the battery cable had been loosened deliberately, Evelyn felt fear finally arrive. It came late, like always. Cold hands, tight throat. Quiet awareness that someone had touched her car while she was upstairs working alone. Daunt saw it. Of course he saw it. Come with me, he said. No, Evelyn. It was the first time he used her first name. She felt it, and hated that she felt it. No, she repeated. I am not getting into your car so you can move me around like a witness in your private trial. You are in danger. I was in danger this morning, too. You still let one of your people call me like he was auditioning for a bad crime movie. He was not one of mine. Then explain who he was. I can T. You mean you won T. He looked at her with something almost painful in his eyes. Sometimes those are the nice answer. She shook her head and looked away. The mechanic reconnected the cable and told her the car would start now, but advised her to have it checked properly in the morning. Evelyn thanked him. Dante paid before she could reach for her wallet. She glared at him. He looked almost resigned. You can dislike it, he said. It is still done. That might be the most honest description of your personality anyone has ever given. For a second, something like amusement touched his mouth. It disappeared quickly, but not before she saw it. She drove home alone, because she insisted on it. Dante did not follow her himself, but she was not foolish enough to believe she was unobserved. At every red light, she checked her mirrors. At every turn, she told herself she should be furious. She was furious, but she was also unsettled by the way Dante had said her name, by the way his eyes had darkened when she called his protection a prison, by the way he had stood in that garage as if keeping distance from her required more discipline than stepping closer. 2 weeks passed before she saw him again. By then, Evelyn had learned two things. First, the pension fund case was worse than she had thought. Money had not merely gone missing. It had been redirected with professional precision, buried through construction invoices, consulting agreements, warehouse leases, and legal settlements that looked boring enough to discourage curiosity. Second, someone wanted her to know she was being watched. A grayish SUV appeared twice near her office, and once outside her mother's apartment building. A man in a baseball cap sat too long in a diner across from her building. Her email received a blank message from an address that vanished by morning. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. It was pressure, not attack. A hand on the back of her neck reminding her it could squeeze. Then came the charity event. Evelyn did not plan to attend. The invitation arrived through a client who served on the hospital board. It was a fundraiser for children needing long-term care, hosted at a downtown hotel with marble floors and chandeliers too large for the room. Evelyn almost declined until she saw the donor list. Betty Logistics was at the top. She wore a black dress, simple pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, and a calm expression she practiced in the elevator. Dante saw her within 5 minutes. He was standing near the center of the ballroom, speaking with a city councilman and a hospital executive. He looked up as if some invisible wire had pulled his attention across the room. Their eyes met. Evelyn felt the old pull before she could defend against it. He did not smile. Neither did she. For nearly an hour they stayed apart. Evelyn spoke with doctors, board members, and 2 retired union men who might have known her father. One of them, after half a glass of wine too many, lowered his voice and said, Tom Hart was a good man. Don't believe what they wrote after. Before Evelyn could ask who they were, a hand closed around her wrist. The man holding her was a donor she had met 10 minutes earlier. Faced, expensive watch, breath smelling of bourbon. You ask too many questions, he said lightly, though his fingers tightened. Pretty women should let dead men rest. Evelyn looked down his hand. Let go. He smiled. I'm only being friendly. A shadow fell over them. Dant stood beside the man. He did not touch him. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the hand on Evelyn's wrist and said, Let go. The man released her so quickly, he nearly stumbled. Mr. Menotti, he said. I didn't realize no, Dan said. You didn't. The man vanished into the crowd. Evelyn's pulse was racing, but her voice stayed steady. You rehearsed that look in a mirror? Dante looked at her wrist. Did he hurt you? You don't get to ask that like you have a right. His eyes lifted to hers. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You don't get to act jealous after telling me there's nothing here. For once the mask cracked, not enough for anyone else to know enough for her. There can't be anything here, he said. The words were quiet, they still cut. Evelyn nodded slowly, as if he had confirmed something she had already known but hoped not to hear again, then stopped showing up like there is. She walked away before he could answer. This time, Daunt did not call after her. Out she sighed. Later that night, Evelyn sat in her car beneath the hotel's glowing entrance and let herself cry. Not much. Loudly, just enough to let her body release what her pride refused to show him. Her phone rang. Gabriel Rossi. She almost did not answer. Gabriel was Dante's closest friend, and that alone made him complicated. But he had always been polite to her, kind even. And there was something in her that did not want to drive home with only Dante's rejection echoing in her head. She answered. Gabriel's voice came through calm and warm. Are you safe? Evelyn closed her eyes. Such a simple question, no command. Warning, no locked door disguised as concern. I am tired, Gabriel, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had softened. Then don't be alone tonight. Coffee, public place, no questions unless you want them. Evelyn looked through the windshield at the wet street ahead. She thought of Daunt standing in the ballroom, saving her from one man and rejecting her in the next breath. She thought of every half-answer, every warning, every distance he insisted was for her good. Then she wiped her face, started the car, and said the word that would change all three of their lives. Okay. Gabriel Rossi chose a coffee shop that did not belong to anyone important. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed. It was not one of Dante Moretti's restaurants, not a hotel lounge where powerful men sat with their backs to the wall, not a private club with dark wood and quieter secrets. It was a small place near Lake Michigan with fogged windows, uneven wooden tables, and a tired college student behind the counter who looked like he had survived on espresso and poor decisions for most of the semester. The place smelled like cinnamon, wet wool, and burnt coffee. Evelyn liked it immediately because no one inside seemed to know who she was, and for one blessed moment, no one cared. She arrived 10 minutes late on purpose. Not because she enjoyed making people wait, but because she wanted to see what Gabriel would do with a little uncertainty. Men revealed themselves in small delays. Some became irritated. Some checked their watches too often. Some smiled in a way that made patience look like performance. Gabriel did none of those things. He sat at a corner table where Evelyn could see both the front door and the side exit, and when she stepped inside, he stood. Not too quickly, not like a man trying to prove manners, but like a man who had been raised with them. You picked the seat facing the door, she said as she approached. Gabriel glanced at the chair, then back at her. You work financial investigations. You ask dangerous questions for a living. Guessed you wouldn't enjoy sitting with your back to the room. Evelyn stopped for half a second. It was a small thing, too small for poetry, maybe. But after months of deciding what was safe for her without asking, the fact that Gabriel had noticed what might make her comfortable felt almost suspiciously kind. That is either thoughtful or concerning, she said. Probably both, he replied. But I can move if I guessed wrong. No, she said, pulling out the chair. You guessed right. He did not look pleased with himself. That mattered too. He only nodded and sat after she did. A waitress came over with a pot of coffee and a patient expression. Gabriel ordered black coffee. Evelyn ordered tea because it was late and she had already lived through enough bad decisions for one night. When the waitress left, the silence settled between them, but it did not feel like pressure. Gabriel had a way of allowing quiet to exist without trying to fill it, just to prove he was harmless. Evelyn wrapped both hands around the warm mug when it arrived. I should say something before this gets strange. Gabriel leaned back slightly. All right, if this is about Dante, I should leave. He did not flinch at the name. He did not pretend confusion. He simply looked at her, calm and direct. If this were about Dante, he said, I wouldn't have asked what kind of coffee you like. Despite herself, Evelyn laughed. It was not a big laugh. It was tired, almost reluctant, but it was real. She had not realized how long it had been since someone made her laugh without making her feel foolish for it. Gabriel smiled, then let the moment pass without grabbing at it. That was a good answer, she said. I try not to waste bad ones on smart women. Careful flattery makes me suspicious, then I'll keep it factual. Evelyn studied him over the rim of her mug. Gabriel Rossi was handsome in a way that did not announce itself from across the room. Dante had the kind of presence that changed the temperature when he entered. Gabriel was different, warmer, easier to underestimate, probably to Manus' disadvantage. He had dark hair, a lawyer-esque watch, and eyes that seemed used to hearing more than people meant to say. He wore a navy coat instead of black, and somehow that felt like a decision. How long have you known him? Evelyn asked. Gabriel knew who she meant. Dante? Since we were 13. That long? Long enough to know when he is lying. Long enough to know when he is lying to himself. Evelyn looked down at her tea. He does that a lot? With you? Gabriel said gently. Yes. The answer should have comforted her. It did not. Only confirmed what some stubborn part of her had been trying. I don't want to be analyzed, she said. Then I want to analyze you. But you analyze him. Unfortunately, that became a survival skill. This time, her smile came easier. Outside the window, rain slid down the glass in thin silver lines. Cars passed with soft hisses along the street. Inside the cafe, someone turned a page. Someone else laughed into a phone. Ordinary life kept going. Indifferent to mafia bosses, old debts, and women who had been told no one too many times, Gabriel rested his hands around his coffee. Do you want to talk about what happened tonight? No. All right. She waited for him to push. He did not. That made her want to talk. He does this thing, she said after a while. Dante. Hears when there is trouble. He knows things before I tell him. He looks at me like I matter, then speaks to me like I am. A problem he is trying to solve, Gabriel. S expression shifted. Not with surprise, but recognition, and the worst part, Evelyn continued, is that I know he believes he's being decent. That is what makes it so hard to hate him. Gabriel nodded slowly. A man can want to protect you and still be wrong in the way he does it. The sentence landed quietly. No drama. No judgment, just truth. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. That's a very fair thing to say about your best friend. I love him like a brother, Gabriel said. That does to mean I confuse his fear with wisdom. There it was again. A kind of loyalty Evelyn understood but had rarely seen, not blind defense. Betrayal dressed as honesty. Something steadier. Gabriel could stand beside Dante and still admit when Dante was wrong. That should not have seemed rare, but it did. My father used to say, loyalty was what people demanded when they didn't want accountability, Evelyn said. Your father sounds like a man I would have liked he was. Her voice softened before she could stop it, at least. I remember him that way. Gabriel did not ask the obvious question. He did not ask how Thomas Hart died, whether the rumors were true, whether the pension fund case was personal. Instead, he waited, and because he waited, Evelyn found herself giving him more. He was a union accountant, she said. Not glamorous, not rich, not powerful. He carried a thermos to work and sharpened pencils with a pocket knife, because he said electric sharpeners ate the good wood too fast. She smiled faintly. Careful about everything. Receipts, oil changes, birthday cards, promises. Gabriel listened with his full attention, the kind that did not interrupt to prove it was listening. When he died, Evelyn continued, people said things, not loudly, never to our faces but enough. Missing money, bad records. Maybe he knew, maybe he helped, maybe he was running from something. Mother refused to believe it. I refused too. But refusal isn't a proof. No, Gabriel said. It is tea. I became good at finding proof that sounds lonely. The words were simple, and they touched something she had not meant to expose. Evelyn looked away toward the window. It can be. Gabriel did not apologize for seeing too much. He only said, "Then I am glad you came tonight." She looked back at him. There was no hunger in the way he said it, no claim. No attempt to step into a space Dant had left empty, just gladness. Clean and uncomplicated. For Evelyn, that was almost harder to accept than danger. Across town, Dante Moretti sat alone in his office with the lights low, and a report he had not read open in front of him. The report concerned a warehouse lease dispute on the south side. It should have taken him 10 minutes to review. He had been staring at the first page for half an hour. His phone buzzed once. A message from one of his men. Rosse met Hart at a cafe near the lake, no threat visible. Dante read it twice, then a third time. Gabriel met Hart, no threat visible. That was the problem, Dante thought. Not all threats looked like threats. Some looked like warmth. Some looked like a man choosing the right table in a coffee shop. Some looked like Evelyn smiling, for the first time after Dant had spent months making sure she did not smile at him. He set the phone face down. A knock sounded at the door. Vincent Caruso entered without waiting for permission, which was one of the privileges Dante allowed him and one of the habits that had begun to irritate him. Late night, Vincent said. Dante did not look up. You have news? Nothing that can wait. Vincent walked in slowly, eyes moving over the unread report, the untouched espresso, the phone turned down on the desk. He smiled a little. Or maybe I do. Dante's gaze lifted. Vincent held up both hands, as if surrendering to a danger he had intentionally provoked. I only meant that the Hart woman is becoming a distraction. No, Dante said. She is becoming a target, same thing in our world. They are not the same thing. Vincent's smile deepened. Careful, boss. There are only two ways a woman stands between friends. A bride, or as a wound. The room went still. Dante's voice lowered. Leave. As Vincent studied him for a second longer than he should have, then bowed his head slightly. Of course. When the door closed, Dante remained behind his desk, motionless. He told himself he was concerned because Evelyn was moving too close to old business. He told himself Gabriel was only being kind. He told himself everything he had done had been necessary. But a man could lie to an entire city more easily than he could lie to himself in a quiet room. At the cafe, Gabriel walked Evelyn to her car when the rain softened. He carried no umbrella, so they shared the narrow awning outside for a moment, both standing close enough to feel the other's warmth, but not close enough to make it awkward. I had a good evening, Gabriel said. Evelyn looked at him. Surprised by how much she believed him, so did I. He did not try to kiss her. He did not touch her hand. He only opened her car door and stepped back. Text me when you get home, he said. Then almost immediately, he added, not because I think you can to take care of yourself, because I like to know you got there. That distinction made her chest tighten. I can do that, she said. She drove home through wet streets, and for once, the silence in her car did not feel like punishment. It felt like space. When she reached her apartment, she sent Gabriel a short message. Home safe. His reply came less than a minute later. Good. Sleep if you can. Evelyn set the phone down beside her bed. She did not sleep right away. She thought of Dante. Because of course she did. She thought of his warning, his distance, the way he said her name like it cost him something. But for the first time, she also thought of another man's kindness without feeling guilty for needing it. And somewhere across the city, Dante Moretti stood in the dark of his office, looking down at a phone he refused to pick up, knowing Evelyn had gone home safely because Gabriel had told him so. That should have been enough. It was not. Gabriel Rossi did not ask Evelyn to the Moretti charity gala right away. That was one of the reasons she had said yes when he finally did. He did not crowd her after that first night at the coffee shop. He texted once the next morning to ask if she had slept, then left her alone until she answered. He did not send flowers. He did not make dramatic promises. He did not try to turn one quiet cup of coffee into a claim. Over the next 2 weeks, she appeared in small, steady ways. Message after a long day, a recommendation for a retired union lawyer who might know something about her father's case, a second coffee, this time during daylight, then a walk by the lake when the wind was cold enough to make both of them regret it, though neither admitted it until they were laughing too hard to pretend otherwise. Evelyn told herself it was harmless. Maybe that was true in the beginning. Gabriel was easy to be around in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. He did not force her to guess what he meant. If he was busy, he said he was busy. If he wanted to see her, he asked. If she said no, he accepted it without making her feel cruel. There was a kind of dignity in that, a kind of emotional discipline that did not ask to be praised. Still, Dant lived in the silence between things. Evelyn hated that. Hated that, after a good conversation with Gabriel, she could still hear Dante's voice in her mind. There can't be anything here. She hated that when Gabriel walked beside her, careful not to touch unless she invited it. She remembered Dante, stepping between her and danger without ever stepping toward her heart. She hated most of all that part of her still wanted Dante to be the man he refused to become. On Thursday afternoon, Gabriel called while Evelyn was reviewing pension records at her desk. His voice was warm, but careful. "There's a gala Saturday night," he said. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "That sounds expensive, it is." Obnoxiously. "Then I already dislike it. You'll dislike it more when I tell you it is hosted by the Morty Foundation." She went still for a second. "Dante will be there." "Yes." Gabriel did not soften the truth. She appreciated that, even when the truth made her chest tighten. "Why are you asking me? Because I like to go with you as a date?" A short pause. Not hesitation. Respect. Yes, as a date. Evelyn looked down at the file open in front of her, but the numbers had blurred. "Do you think that as cruel? Only if you read doing it to hurt him." She closed her eyes. That was the kind of answer Gabriel gave, honest enough to be inconvenient. "I'm not," she said. "Then there's your answer." "No," she said quietly. "There's still yours, you know, he'll hate it." "I know, and you as best friend, I am." "Then, why would you put yourself in the middle of this?" Gabriel exhaled slowly. "Evelyn, I spent half my life watching Dante punish himself and call it discipline. I want to let him punish you too and call it protection." She did not answer right away. Gabriel continued gentler. "Now, but I'm not asking you to make a statement. I am not asking you to prove anything. Come with me. It should be because you want to. Not because he refused you. Not because you angry. Not because you need someone to see you walk in with me." Evelyn looked toward the window. The city beyond the glass looked pale and hard in the late afternoon light. "I'm tired of living, like my heart is waiting outside somebody else's locked door," she said. Gabriel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then let's not make the night about the door." Saturday arrived cold and bright, the kind of Chicago evening that made women regret beautiful dresses and men pretend they were not freezing in their suits. The gala was held in the ballroom of an old downtown hotel, all marble columns, crystal chandeliers, and gold light reflecting off polished floors. Outside, black cars lined the curb. Inside, violins played near the staircase while waiters moved through the crowd with champagne and practiced smiles. Evelyn almost turned back before she reached the entrance. Gabriel noticed. Of course he did. Stood beside her in a navy tuxedo, calm as ever, one hand resting lightly near her elbow but not touching. "We can leave," he said. She looked at him. "You mean that?" "Yes. No questions?" "One question," he said. "Do you want to leave?" Evelyn took a breath. She thought of Dante telling her to stay at a distance. She thought of every warning, every half answers, every time he looked at her like she mattered and spoke like she was forbidden. "No," she said. "I want to go in." Gabriel nodded once, then we go in. The room noticed them, not loudly. Rooms like that did not gasp, they shifted. Conversations thinned, eyes moved, men took quick measurements, and women understood faster than the men did. Evelyn felt the attention touch her skin, but she kept walking. Her dress was dark blue, simple, elegant, with long sleeves and a neckline modest enough to avoid spectacle. She had not dressed to wound anyone that mattered to her. If Dante hurt tonight, it would not be because she aimed the knife. It would be because he had left it lying between them for too long. Gabriel placed his hand lightly at her back as they descended the short steps into the ballroom. It was not possessive. It was not a performance. It was steadying, and only for a moment. Dante Moretti saw them before they reached the floor. He was standing near the front of the room, speaking with the judge and the director of the children's hospital. He wore a black tuxedo, crisp white shirt, no expression out of place. In any other room, he would have looked like the center of gravity. Angled toward him without realizing they were doing it. Then his eyes found Evelyn. The judge kept talking. Dante stopped listening. For a few seconds, the entire room seemed to lose sound. Evelyn could not hear the violins, the glasses, the low voices around her. She could only see Dante standing there with the glass untouched in his hand, his body perfectly still, his face calm, except for the one thing he could not hide quickly enough: pain. It passed almost immediately. Anyone else would have missed it. Evelyn did not. Gabriel did not either. Dante's gaze dropped to Gabriel's hand near her back. It had already fallen away, but Dante had seen enough. Fingers tightened around the glass, not enough to break it. Dante Moretti would never give a room that much, but enough. He did not walk toward them. He did not say her name. He did not call Gabriel over. He simply stood there, as if the man who had moved entire unions, bought silence from senators, and frightened killers into obedience had forgotten how to take a step. Mara Moretti appeared beside him, as if she had been summoned by the silence. She was a graceful older woman in black silk, her silver hair pinned neatly, her eyes sharper than most knives in the room. She followed Dante's gaze and understood immediately. "You rejected that woman like a man making a sacrifice," Mara said softly, "but you look at her like a man watching another man receive the blessing you threw away." Dante did not look at his mother. "Not now," he said. It's what frightened men always say when the truth arrives on time. Across the ballroom, Gabriel guided Evelyn toward a group near the hospital board. He introduced her with quiet pride, not as an accessory, not as a mysterious woman on his arm, but as Evelyn Hart, a financial investigator whose work had helped recover stolen funds for families and small businesses. He did not exaggerate, he did not diminish. He simply named her fully. Evelyn felt something in her loosen. A man could make space for a woman without making her smaller. She was almost embarrassed by how new that felt. For the next hour, she moved through conversations with Gabriel beside her. He did not hover. He did not answer for her. When a donor asked what kind of financial investigation she did, Gabriel stepped back half an inch and let her speak. When an older woman from the hospital foundation complimented her dress, he smiled and said nothing, as if her beauty did not require his ownership. Small things. Ordinary things. Things that should not have felt radical. But Dante watched all of them. He watched Evelyn laugh at something Gabriel said. He watched Gabriel bring her sparkling water instead of champagne after remembering she was driving. He watched them stand close enough to look familiar, not close enough to look improper. That restraint, somehow, cut worse than if Gabriel had kissed her in front of the entire room. Vincent Caruso watched Dante watching them. From near the bar, Vincent lifted his drink slightly, his expression thoughtful. He did not yet know exactly how he would use this, but he knew weakness when he saw it, and Dante Moretti had just shown him one in public. The first dance began near 10. Couples moved toward the floor, some eager, some obligated, some already tired of charity but too polite to leave before dessert. Gabriel turned to Evelyn. "Would you like to dance?" Evelyn glanced across the room before she could stop herself. Dante was looking directly at her. The smart thing would have been to say no, the careful thing, the kind thing, perhaps. But Evelyn had spent too long making herself smaller around Dante's silence. She looked back at Gabriel. "Yes," she said, "I would." Gabriel offered his hand. She took it. They danced simply. No dramatic spins, no staged intimacy. Gabriel held her with respect, leaving enough space for her to breathe. He was a good dancer, but not showy. Evelyn found herself relaxing after the first few steps. "You all right?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. Gabriel's mouth curved faintly. "Fair. But I'm still glad I came." His expression softened. "So am I." Dante watched from the edge of the room, motionless. Mara stood nearby, saying nothing now. She did not have to. The lesson was happening without her help. When the dance ended, Evelyn stepped away from Gabriel and excused herself for air. The balcony outside the ballroom was narrow and cold, overlooking the wet lights of downtown Chicago. She had barely taken 2 breaths before the door opened behind her. She knew who it was without turning. "Gabriel is my best friend," Dante said. Evelyn looked out over the street. "I know, then you know. This is complicated." She turned then. He stood a few feet away, formal, controlled, beautiful in the terrible way dangerous things could be beautiful. "No, don't," she said. "You made it simple every time you said no." He absorbed that like a blow. For a moment he looked almost human enough to reach for, but Evelyn had learned something important about locked doors. Wanting them to open did not mean she had to keep standing outside. She walked past him and went back into the light, where Gabriel was waiting without asking her to explain. Behind her, Dante remained on the balcony, unable to move. By Monday morning, Evelyn Hart had convinced herself that she had survived the gala with most of her dignity intact. That was not the same as saying she had survived it untouched. Dante's face on the balcony had followed her home, followed her into sleep, followed her into the quiet gray light of morning, when she stood barefoot in her kitchen and waited for coffee she did not really want. She had told him the truth. Made it simple every time he said no. And still, some stubborn, foolish part of her had wanted him to stop her when she walked past him. Not order her, not warn her, not wrap concern in control. Just say her name like he finally knew what it cost her to leave. He had not. So Evelyn went to work. Work was honest in a way people rarely were. Numbers could lie, but they left marks. False invoices has had patterns. Missing money had movement. Pension records, especially old pension records, had a kind of stubborn memory. People could die. Companies could dissolve. Men could change names, destroy files, buy silence, but somewhere in some forgotten box or badly scanned archive, a number would remain where someone had failed to erase it. That morning, Evelyn returned to the old Union pension fund with a different kind of focus. The gala had given her 2 useful conversations. One retired Union Fund trustee remembered her father, not as a thief, but as a careful man who got scared too late. Another had mentioned an old storage facility on the west side where boxes from defunct union offices had been sent after a merger. By noon, Evelyn had made 3 calls, annoyed one county clerk, bribed no one, threatened politely twice, and obtained access to a digital index of archived fund documents that had not been touched in years. At 2:17 p.m., she found her father's name, not in a rumor. Not in a newspaper clipping, not in a whispered accusation passed between men who preferred their sins old enough to be decorative. On a report, Thomas Hart. His signature appeared at the bottom of a preliminary internal warning, dated 3 weeks before his death. The report was short, only 4 pages, and the scan was poor, but Evelyn knew her father's handwriting the way some people knew prayers: the slant of the T, the tight loop in the H, the way he pressed too hard when he wrote his last name, as if a signature was not complete unless the paper felt it. Her breath caught. For a long moment, she did nothing. She just stared at the screen while the office around her continued, as if the world had not shifted. Pipes knocked in the wall. A car horn sounded 7 floors below. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed too loudly at a joke that was not funny. The title of the document read Irregular Disbursement Pattern, Local 418 Pension Reserves. Evelyn clicked it open. The report did not accuse her father of stealing. It did the opposite. Thomas Hart had flagged a series of pension transfers routed through consulting contracts, warehouse maintenance fees, and construction vendor payments. The language was careful, professional, but the meaning was clear. Someone had been bleeding money from workers' retirement accounts and hiding it under ordinary business expenses. At the bottom, under recommendations, her father had written, "Immediate external audit required. Freeze discretionary disbursements pending review. Notify federal oversight if board fails to respond." Evelyn read the last line 3 times. Then she leaned back in her chair and covered her mouth. All her life, people had treated her father's story like smoke. Maybe he knew, maybe he helped, maybe he was involved, maybe he panicked, maybe he ran out of road, because guilt made men careless. Evelyn had been a child when he died, too young to defend him with anything but belief. And belief, she had learned, was not enough in a world that respected documents more than daughters. Now she had a document. Her hands shook as she printed the report. The printer hummed slowly, each page sliding out like the past returning one sheet at a time. She was still standing over it when her phone rang. "Gabriel," she answered without thinking. "Evelyn?" he said. "You all right?" "No," she said. Her voice sounded far away. "I found him." Gabriel was silent for half a second. "Your father?" "Yes. Where are you, my office?" "I am coming." She almost said no. She almost told him she did not need anyone. Because habit was a hard thing to kill. Then she looked at her father's signature and felt the weight of being alone with it. "Okay," she said. Gabriel arrived 20 minutes later, coat damp from light rain. Expression calm, but eyes alert. He did not reach for the papers until she handed them to him. Another small thing. Another reason she had begun to understand difference between being helped and being handled. He read the report standing beside her desk. By the time he reached the last page, his face had changed. "This doesn't frame him, Gabriel," quietly. "This clears." "And should have cleared him," Evelyn said, but it disappeared. Gabriel looked at the date. 3 weeks before the accident. Donna call it that, he looked up. She did not apologize. I to know what it was yet. Donna call it that. Gabriel nodded. All right. Together they worked through the index. Gabriel had legal access, Evelyn did not, and he knew how to find sealed references without pretending sealed meant invisible. He called a retired court clerk who owed him a favor. Evelyn sent a formal request to the archive administrator. They found mentions of a board meeting that had no minutes, a vendor list that had been removed, and a name that appeared too often around the edges of everything Caruso Holdings. Vincent Caruso. Evelyn knew the name from Daunt's World. Underboss. Old guard. Dangerous in the blunt, traditional way. A man who looked like loyalty from one angle and rot from another. Gabriel saw her recognize it. "You know him?" he asked. "Know enough. Then you know this is bigger than a pension fund." Evelyn looked at her father's signature again. "It was always bigger than that. I just didn't have proof." That evening, Dante Moretti found out Gabriel had helped her. He did not call first. He arrived at Gabriel's office just after dark, walking past the receptionist with the calm authority of a man who had never been stopped by a desk. Gabriel was alone in the conference room, spreading old filings across the table. He looked up, unsurprised. Dante closed the door behind him. "You should have come to me first," Dante said. Gabriel set down the file in his hand. No, she should have been told first. The room went still. Dante's face remained controlled, but Gabriel had known him too long to miss the warning signs, the slight stillness in the shoulders. Quietness before anger decided whether it needed a voice. "You don't know what you're reopening," Dante said. "I know exactly what I opening that S. Why I am doing it with her instead of around her. This can get her killed, so can ignorance," Gabriel said. "You keep forgetting that." Dante stepped closer to the table. "Don't to make this about your opinion of me. It isn't. It is about Evelyn. That may be why you re-struggling for a moment." It looked as if Dante might say something he could not take back. Then he looked down at the report, bearing Thomas Hart's signature. His expression shifted so slightly that only Gabriel would have caught it. Pain. Not surprise us. Pain. "You knew," Gabriel said. Dante did not answer. Gabriel's voice lowered. "How long?" Dante looked toward the dark window. "Long enough." "Then God help you when she asks." Dante left without another word. By the time Evelyn returned to her office the next morning, the lock had been picked. She knew before she opened the door all the way. The metal plate was scratched. The handle sat half a degree wrong. She had spent too many years investigating men who thought women did not notice small damage. Inside, her desk drawers were open. File folders lay scattered across the floor. Her backup drive was missing from the second drawer, though not the real one taped behind the radiator. Whoever had done it was professional enough not to smash things, but arrogant enough to leave a message. A single sheet of paper sat on her desk. "Your father asked questions too." Evelyn stood very still. Fear came first this time, then anger. She took photos of the office before touching anything. She checked the radiator. The real backup was still there. She checked the cloud upload, complete. Then she called the building manager, then Gabriel, then the police, in that order. Daunt arrived before the police. Of course he did. He entered with two men behind him, but one look from Evelyn stopped all three at the threshold. "Oh," she said. Dante looked at the room, then at her. His face had gone cold in a way that made the air feel thinner. "You need to leave. Don't walk in here giving commands. This is not the time." "It is exactly the time." Her voice shook, but she did not lower it. "Not after years of deciding what I was allowed to know. Not after hiding my father from me. Not after standing there, like you had the right to reject me for my own good." His eyes moved to the framed photograph on her desk. Thomas Hart stood in the picture, younger than Dante was now, holding a little girl on his shoulders while fireworks blurred behind them. Evelyn had looked at that picture 1,000 times, but she had never seen Dante look at it. He looked like a man staring at a ghost that had finally turned around. The anger in Evelyn faltered, not gone, but changed by what she saw on his face. "You knew him," she said. Dante was silent. Inside the office, voices echoed near the elevators. The police were arriving. Gabriel's footsteps sounded in the hall behind them. Evelyn stepped closer to Dante, holding her father's report in one hand and the threatening note in the other. "Tell me," she said. Dante looked from the photograph to Evelyn. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost stripped of power. "I knew your father." Evelyn's breath caught. Dante did not look away, and I was there the night he realized he was going to die. Dante did not explain himself in Evelyn's office. He could have tried. The police were in the hallway. Gabriel was standing behind him, and Evelyn was looking at him as if every silent year between them had become a wall she was finally ready to tear down with her bare hands. But Dante Moretti knew the difference between a confession and an explanation. One belonged in a crowded room where a man could shape it to survive. The other required a place quiet enough for the dead to be heard. So he only said, "Not here." Evelyn almost laughed at him, because after everything he had hidden, those two words sounded like another locked door. But then she saw his face. There was no command in it this time, no warning. No attempt to move her around like a piece on his board. There was only a tiredness so old it almost looked like surrender. 2 hours later, after the police had taken photographs, after the office door had been taped, after Gabriel had made 3 calls that sounded calm, only because he was very good at sounding calm, Evelyn agreed to go with Dante. Not in his car alone. Gabriel drove behind them. Dante did not argue. That alone told Evelyn something had changed. The man who had once treated her safety like a private matter was now accepting a witness. They drove west, away from the glass towers and expensive restaurants, into an older part of Chicago where the streets narrowed, and the buildings seemed to remember harder winters. The church stood between a closed hardware store and a row of brick apartments with rusted fire escapes. It was small, old, and tired, its stone steps worn down in the middle by decades of ordinary people carrying ordinary grief. A sign near the door read St. Bridget S., though half the gold paint had peeled away. Evelyn looked at the church, then at Dante. "Why here?" Dante kept his eyes on the front doors. "Because this is where your father came when he no longer trusted anyone else." Inside, the church smelled like dust, candle wax, and old wood. There were no parishioners at that hour. Only rows of empty pews and colored light falling through stained glass onto the floor. Gabriel stayed near the back without being asked. He did not intrude, but he did not leave either. Evelyn was grateful for that more than she wanted to admit. Dante walked to the third pew from the front and stopped. He touched the worn edge of the wood with 2 fingers, as if greeting something painful. "Your father sat here," he said, "every Thursday at 6:30. Nobody noticed a working man praying after his shift. They noticed lawyers, they noticed accountants in city offices, they noticed men walking into police stations, but a man in a church? People let that pass." Evelyn stood beside him, arms folded tightly. "You met him here?" "Yes." "How many times?" "4." The number cut her more than she expected. 4 times. 4 meetings with her father that Dante had carried for years while she had carried only questions. Dante looked toward the altar. Thomas found money moving out of local 418s pension reserve through vendor payments. Construction repairs that never happened. Warehouse maintenance contracts paid twice. Consulting fees to companies with no employees. He thought at first it was fraud by a few board members. He found the shell companies. Some of them were connected to my father's people. Your father, Evelyn said. Yes. And Vincent? Daunt's jaw tightened. Vincent was already close to the money. Evelyn waited. She had learned that if she spoke too quickly, powerful men used her anger as an excuse to avoid the harder truth. Dantane continued. I was younger then, not innocent. I wanted to insult you by pretending that, but I was not yet in control. I still believed parts of the organization could be separated. Business on one side, blood on the other. Your father understood before I did that the line was a story. Men like us told ourselves. Men like you, Evelyn said. Dante accepted the correction. Like me. The church was quiet enough that Evelyn could hear the rain beginning outside, ticking softly against the stained glass. What happened? She asked. Dan's face changed, not dramatically, but enough. The boss faded, and something heavier took his place. Thomas came here the last time with a folder under his coat. He was scared, but not for himself. He knew someone had been inside his office. He knew records had been copied. He said, had followed your mother to the grocery store, and then vanished before she noticed. He had already made copies of everything. He planned to give them to a federal prosecutor the next morning. Evelyn's throat tightened. But he didn't know because he died. Dante closed his eyes for a moment because he was killed. The words entered Evelyn quietly. There was no thunder in them, no sudden collapse. Had suspected it. Maybe some part of her had known it for years. Still, hearing it spoken in Dane's voice made the old grief shift shape. Her father had not been careless. He had not been guilty. He had not simply run out of road in bad weather. Someone had decided he was inconvenient and removed him from the world. Evelyn sat down in the pew before her knees could betray her. Daunt did not sit beside her. He remained standing, giving her the space he should have given her years ago. What did he ask you? She said. Dante's voice dropped. He asked me to help him get the files out. I said I would. He asked something else. Evelyn looked up. He said, if anything happens to me, keep my wife and my little girl away from your world. The words landed between them like a living thing. Dante finally sat, but not close. I gave him my word. Evelyn stared at the altar. She imagined her father sitting in that same pew, tired after work, frightened, still thinking about his wife and daughter before himself. She imagined Dante younger, harder in some ways and softer in others, promising a dying man's future without understanding what that promise would become. You paid my mother's bills, she said. Yes. You kept men away from us, yes. You buried his connection to you, yes. And when I grew up and started asking questions, you decided I was still the little girl he asked you to protect. Dante did not answer fast enough. That was answer enough. Evelyn turned toward him, tears in her eyes now, though her voice remained steady. You kept me safe from men with guns, but you didn't keep me safe from lizies. Dante looked at her then, and for once there was no defense ready in him. I thought I was honoring him, he said. No, Evelyn said. You used my father's last wish to build a cage around my life, and then you called it honor. Dante flinched, not visibly to anyone who did not know how to look, but Evelyn had learned how to read him, and she saw it. Good, she thought. Let it hurt. Truth was supposed to hurt when it arrived late. I was 10, she continued. I grew up hearing whispers that my father might have been a thief. Do you know what that does to a child? To love someone and still wonder if the world knows something terrible about him. Dante's hands closed together. I didn't know how to clear him without pulling you in. So you chose silence. I chose distance. Same cage, different lock. Behind them, Gabriel lowered his head. He did not speak. This was not his moment, but his presence steadied the room. Evelyn stood. I need the files. Daunt looked up. Evelyn, no. Her voice cut cleanly through the church. You don't get to say my name like a warning anymore. He fell silent. I need every file you have on my father, every company, every name, every payment, every lie that was used to bury him. If I give you that, men will come. They already came to my office. Worse men. Then I'll prepare for worse men. Dan stood too. Your father wanted you away from this. My father wanted me alive, Evelyn said. He did not ask you to make me ignorant. That sentence seemed to take something out of him. For years, Dante had survived by turning one promise into law. Now Evelyn was showing him the part he had refused to see. A promise without truth could become another form of betrayal. He nodded once. Closely, you'll have the files. Not because you allow it. No, he said, because they yours. It was the first right answer he had given her. It did not fix anything, but it mattered. Outside the church, the rain had thickened. Gabriel waited near the steps while Evelyn came out first. Dante remained inside for a minute longer, alone with the pew where Thomas Hart had once sat. Gabriel looked at Evelyn. Do you want me to take you home? She nodded. She did not trust herself to speak yet. When Dante came out, Gabriel met in his eyes. There was no triumph in him, no satisfaction at having been the one Evelyn chose to leave with. Only sadness and something firmer than sadness. Keep acting like losing her proves you protected her, Gabriel said quietly. Maybe it only proves you hurt her. Dante looked past him to Evelyn, who stood beneath the church awning with her coat pulled tight around her. For once, he had no answer, and for once, Evelyn did not wait for one. Vincent Caruso had survived in the Moridi organization for 30 years, because he knew the difference between anger and weakness. Anger was loud, weakness was quiet. Anger made men throw glasses, raise their voices, slam fists against tables. Weakness made them stare too long at the wrong door. Weakness made them pause before giving orders. Weakness made them look at a woman across a ballroom as if she had taken something from them that they had handed away themselves. Vincent had watched Dante Moretti that night at the gala, and what he saw pleased him more than any open failure could have. Dante had not shouted, he had not struck Gabriel. He had not embarrassed himself in front of the city useful people, but he had frozen. For a man like Dante, that was worse. It meant the wound was deep enough to reach the body before the mind could stop it. 2 mornings after Evelyn left the church with Gabriel, a plain envelope arrived on Dante's desk. No return address, no fingerprints that would matter. His secretary brought it in with the rest of the mail, unaware that some messages were designed to look ordinary, because ordinary things passed through guarded doors more easily than threats. Dante opened it alone. Inside were 4 photographs. Gabriel Rossi leaving a federal building downtown. Gabriel sitting across from a woman in a gray suit at a quiet restaurant near the courthouse. Gabriel handing her a folder. Gabriel standing beside her car, head lowered, as if speaking confidentially. Hunt looked at the photos for a long time. He recognized the woman, Caroline Mercer, a federal attorney. Smart, clean record, dangerous because she was patient. 6 months earlier, Dante had asked Gabriel to explore a legal path to dismantle the worst parts of the old Morty business without dragging innocent workers, drivers, warehouse clerks, and pensioners into the wreckage. Dante had known those conversations would require someone like Mercer. He knew that, and still, looking at the photographs, something ugly moved in him. Not because it's Gabriel had met the attorney, because Gabriel had met Evelyn's eyes without making her feel punished. Because Gabriel had taken her home from the church. Because Gabriel knew how to stand beside her without turning protection into ownership. Jealousy did not arrive in Dante's fire. It arrived as cold reasoning with a poisoned root. The photographs did not prove betrayal, but they gave pain a place to stand and call itself logic. By noon, Gabriel was standing in Dante's office. He came alone, he always did. That was part of the trust between them, or had been. He wore a dark suit, no overcoat, no visible tension except around the eyes. Gabriel saw the envelope on the desk before Dante touched it. He knew immediately. Where did those come from? Gabriel asked. Dante slid the photographs across the desk. Maybe you should tell me. Gabriel picked up the first one, then the second. His face did not change much, but disappointment settled over him like a shadow. I know what these are. I know what they show. No, Gabriel said. You know what they meant to make you feel. Dante's eyes sharpened. Answer the question. Gabriel set the photographs down carefully. as if putting down something fragile and dirty at the same time. Yes, I met with Caroline Mercer. Because you asked me to find a legal way out of Vincent S.'s side of the business before he burns the whole organization down around you. That meeting was not scheduled through me, because Mercer went to speak if she thought the room belonged to you. Dante leaned back. So you made the decisions for me. Gabriel gave a short, humorless laugh. That S is rich coming from you. The air changed. Dante stood. Careful. No, Gabriel said. That is exactly the problem with men like us. We mistake careful for honest. We use careful when we mean afraid. We use careful when we mean controlling. Use careful when we don't want anyone to ask who benefits from the silence. Dante's voice lowered. Do not turn this into a speech, then stop turning pain into evidence. For a moment, neither man moved. They had been boys together once, though no one looking at them now would have believed it. Gabriel had been there when Dante's father first handed his son a business card instead of affection. Dante had been there when Gabriel buried his older brother after a union dispute became a street fight and then a funeral. They had learned loyalty before they understood kindness. They had protected each other when protections still meant fists, doors, alibis, and silence. But men grew older, and if they were not careful, loyalty became a room without windows. Dante looked at Gabriel as though seeing both the friend and the threat at once. Are you working against me? Gabriel's face hardened then, not with anger but with hurt. I was working for the future you said you wanted. Dante did not answer. Gabriel stepped closer to the desk. You don't think I betrayed you because of a photograph. You think I betrayed you because she smiled at me. That struck clean. Dante's hand closed once at his side. Gabriel saw it and continued anyway. You pushed her away, over and over. You told her there could be nothing. You hid behind her father's last wish, like it gave you the right to make every choice she was never allowed to make. And when she finally accepted kindness from someone else, you looked at it like theft. Dante moved around the desk, slow and controlled. You are forgetting who you were speaking to. No, Gabriel said. For once I am remembering exactly who I am speaking to, not the boss, my friend. The man who has been bleeding for years and calling it discipline because grief sounds too human. Dante stopped. The words landed harder than Gabriel expected. He saw it in the brief shift of Dante's eyes, in the way his silence changed shape. The office door opened. Evelyn stood in the doorway. Neither man had heard her approach. Gabriel had sent her his location before he arrived, a habit formed from years of knowing that Dante rarely lost control. But when he did, the room could become a dangerous place without a single weapon being drawn. Evelyn looked from Gabriel to Dante, then to the photographs on the desk. So this is what we're redoing now, she said. Dante turned toward her. You shouldn't be here. Evelyn's expression did not change. You still begin every sentence to me with a locked door. Gabriel lowered his head slightly, not in shame but in acknowledgement. This was her room now, or at least her truth. Evelyn walked to the desk and picked up one of the photographs. Who sent these? Dante said nothing. Gabriel said, someone who wants him to stop trusting me. And it almost worked? She asked. The silence answered. Silence set the photograph down. You rejected me, Dante. Then you punished the man who didn't. Dante looked as though she had cut him in a place no one else could reach. She was not finished. Gabriel didn't steal anything from you. You left me standing outside your life and called it protection. He opened a chair at a coffee shop and asked what I wanted to drink. If that feels like betrayal, maybe the problem is not him. Dante's gaze dropped for half a second. That tiny surrender should have satisfied her. It did not. Before anyone could speak again, Evelyn's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She almost ignored it, but something's about the sender line made her pause. Unknown. Attached file. Message, she opened it. A scanned ledger appeared on the screen, old and grainy, with columns of payments, shell companies, dates, initials, and handwritten notes in the margins. Evelyn's investigator mind took over immediately. She enlarged the image, scrolling past numbers until 3 names appeared on the same page. Thomas Hart, Clarabelle, Vincent Caruso. The room seemed to fall away. Gabriel moved beside her. What is it? Evelyn turned the phone so both men could see. Dant stared at the screen. At first he looked only confused. Then Clara's name seemed to reach him, not as information, but as a ghost. Evelyn looked at him. Who is this Clara Bell for the first time since she had known him? Daunt Moree looked unguarded. Not weak, not broken, worse young. She was a reporter, he said quietly. Gabriel's face changed. He knew the name, but not like Daunt did. Evelyn kept her eyes on Daunt. That's not all she was. Daunt looked at the ledger again. His voice was almost gone when he answered. No, he said. She was not. Outside the office's windows, Chicago moved on under a hard gray sky. Trucks crossed bridges. Men made deals. People lied over lunch and called it business. But inside that room, the past had found all three of them at once, and this time, Dante could not reject it. Declara Bell's name changed the room in a way no gun ever could. Evelyn had seen men react to threats before. She had watched guilty executives sweat through depositions, watched union officers lie badly when numbers turned against them, watched widows sit very still when paperwork confirmed what grief had already known. But Dante Moretti did not react like a guilty man. He reacted like someone had opened a grave inside his chest and called out from the bottom of it. For a long moment, no one spoke. The old ledger glowed on Evelyn's phone between them. Thomas Hart's name, Clara Bell's name, and Vincent Caruso's name lined up on the same page like three pieces of a story that had never been meant to meet. Gabriel was the first to move. He took the phone gently from Evelyn, enlarged the image, and studied the rows of payments. Entries are from 17 years ago, he said. Consulting disbursements, warehouse security fees, legal retainers, same shell structure as the pension fund. Evelyn looked at Daunt. Who was she? Daunt did not answer right away. He walked to the window, but he did not look out. He only stood there, with one hand resting against the glass, as if he needed the cold to keep himself inside his own body. Clara Bell was an investigative journalist, he said at last. She wrote about labor corruption, attention theft. She was stubborn, brilliant, and impossible to scare. The softness in his voice told Evelyn the rest before he said it. You loved her, she said. Daunt closed his eyes for half a second. Yes, the word was quiet, not romantic, not dramatic. It's true. Gabriel lowered the phone. He knew about Clara, Evelyn realized, but not enough. Maybe no one did. Some grief, especially in men like Dant, became a locked room everyone learned not to enter. Dant turned back to them. She died in a car bombing. I was told it was an outside crew trying to send a message to my father through me. Vincent said Clara had been killed because she was close to me. Evelyn felt the pieces moving, slowly, horribly. And you believed him. I was 29, Dante said. Angry enough to kill, young enough to be led, and arrogant enough to believe pain made me smarter. There was no self-pity in the sentence that made it harder to hear. What did you do? Evelyn asked. Daunt's face hardened, not with pride but with shame and stillness. I became useful to my father, to Vincent, to the men who wanted me cold. The room fell silent again. Evelyn thought of every time Daunt had pushed her away, every warning, every refusal, every locked door. Clara had not just died before her. Clara had become the reason Dante believed love was a death sentence. Gabriel set the phone on the desk. Who told you it was an outside crew? Dante's eyes moved to him. Nobody needed the answer spoken, but Dante spoke it anyway. Vincent. That name sat in the room like smoke. Evelyn picked up the phone again, her mind turning faster now. This ledger connects Clara to my father. If Clara was investigating the same money trail Thomas found, then she was killed because she loved you. Daunt looked at her. She was killed because she knew something, Evelyn said. For the first time since Clara's name appeared, Dante looked afraid, not for himself. For the shape of his own life, maybe. For what would remain if the story he had built his guilt around turned out to be false? Gabriel was already reaching for his coat. I'll pull the old police file. Not the public one. Technical report. If there was a bomb, there was a device analysis. Somebody signed it. Daunt said. That file disappeared. Gabriel looked back at him. Files don't disappear. They move into places men like Vincent assume honest people are too tired to check. Evelyn almost smiled. Almost. Over the next 48 hours, none of them slept much. Gabriel worked through legal contacts who still owed him favors from years when favors mattered more than invoices. Evelyn rebuilt the ledger digitally, entry by entry, linking shell companies to vendor accounts and vendor accounts to union payments. Dante sent men into old storage rooms not to threaten, not to break, but to retrieve whatever the Morty organization had buried under dust and fear. By Thursday night, Gabriel found the report. He brought it to Evelyn's office after midnight, his tie loose, his eyes tired but sharp. Dante arrived 10 minutes later. No guards. No entourage. Just him looking older than he had the night she met him. Gabriel laid the photocopied document on the desk. Original device analysis, he said. Clara's car wasn't hit by an outside crew. The explosive was placed inside the vehicle while it was parked in a private garage. Evelyn read the highlighted line, access required, internal or authorized service level entry. Dante did not touch the paper. Who had access? Evelyn asked. Gabriel looked at Dante. Moretti people, your father's people, Vincent S. people. The words were careful, but the meaning was not. Dante's face became unreadable. Frightened Evelyn more than anger would have. All these years, he said quietly. Nobody answered. Because what could anyone say to a man realizing that the grief that shaped him may have been designed? Later, after Gabriel left to make another call, Evelyn found Dante standing in the hallway outside her office. The building was mostly dark. Rain tapped against the windows like a memory repeating itself. You thought loving her killed her, Evelyn said. Dante's voice was rough, yes. And then you thought loving me would do the same. He did not deny it. Evelyn stepped closer, though not too close. Dante, if Clara died because she was investigating Vincent, then pushing me away never protected me from the real danger. It only kept me uninformed. He looked at her then, and she saw the wound clearly. Not the boss, not the man who could silence her room. Just a man who had carried the wrong guilt for so long. He did not know how to set it down. I don't know who I am without that mistake, he said. The honesty surprised her. You start there, she said, with not knowing. That's better than building your life around a lie. The next morning, Evelyn received a message from an unknown number. No greeting, no signature. If you want your father's full file, come alone. West Fulton Warehouse, 8 p.m. Bring no Morty men unless you want the rest burned. Attached was a photograph of Thomas Hart's old leather notebook. Evelyn knew it immediately. The corner was torn. The elastic band was stretched. Her father had carried it everywhere. Her first instinct was grief. Her second was suspicion. Her third was planning. She did not call Dante first. She knew what he would do. He would lock the city down, bury her beneath protection, turn her father's notebook into another reason she was not allowed to choose. So Evelyn did what she had learned to do, long before Dante Moretti entered her life. She prepared. She sent the location and message to Gabriel with a delayed instruction. If I don't check in by 915, send everything to Mercer's. She uploaded the ledger, the technical report, and her father's warning document to 3 separate locations. She activated a timed release to a journalist she trusted from a previous case. Put a small recorder in her coat lining and a second phone in her boot. Then she went. The warehouse sat near the old industrial corridor, where half the buildings had been renovated into expensive lofts, and the other half still looked like the city had forgotten to finish grieving them. Evelyn parked 2 blocks away and walked under weak streetlights. Her coat pulled tight against the wind, the side door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of rust, dust, and old rainwater. Overhead lights flickered in long rows. Somewhere deeper in the building, metal shifted. Miss Hart? Vincent Caruso's voice called from the shadows. You came. Evelyn stopped, keeping her hands visible, and her voice steady. You expected me to. Vincent stepped into the light, holding her father's notebook in one hand. He looked almost disappointed by her calm. Your father had that same look, he said, like fear was something he could outthink. Evelyn's recorder was running. What happened to him? She asked. Vincent smiled. People like your father, like Clarabelle like you always think truth saves lives. He walked closer, slow and relaxed. Most of the time it only decides who dies first. Behind Evelyn, the door slammed shut, the lock clicked, then the lights went out. Gabriel received Evelyn S. delayed message at 9:16 p.m. He had been standing in his office with a phone in one hand and Clara Bell's technical report in the other, reading the same line over and over when the alert came through. The message was short, calm, and terrifying in the way only Evelyn could make danger. Sound organized West Fulton Warehouse Sanchez. Vincent has my father's notebook. If I didn't check in, send everything to Mercer. Gabriel did not waste 1 second being angry that she had gone alone. Anger could wait. Evelyn might not. He called Dante immediately. Dante answered on the first ring. What happened? Gabriel was already moving toward the elevator. Vincent has her. There was no curse, no shout, no dramatic threat. Only a silence so sharp Gabriel could almost hear it cut through the line. Where? Dante asked. West Fulton, old warehouse district. She sent the files to me on a delay. She planned for this. Of course she did, Dante said. And for the first time, Gabriel heard something in his voice that was not fear, not rage, but respect. 10 minutes later, they were in the same car, tearing through wet Chicago streets with no siren and no wasted words. Dante sat in the back seat, one hand clenched around the phone, his face still enough to frighten men who did not know him. Gabriel knew him. Stillness was not control. It was a man holding himself together by force if anything happens to her. Dante began. Gabriel cut him off. Don't make this about what you'll do if you lose her. Make it about what she needs while she is still alive. Dante turned his head slowly. Gabriel did not look away. You want to love her? Start there. Inside the warehouse, Evelyn was not waiting to be rescued. She had already triggered the fire alarm by breaking the glass on an old emergency panel. The red lights flashed across the concrete walls. Somewhere overhead, a sprinkler pipe coughed but failed to release water. Vincent's men were shouting in the dark, confused by the alarm, the noise, and the fact that the woman they had locked inside was not where they had left her. Evelyn ran through a narrow service corridor, breathing hard, her father's notebook tucked under her coat. Her recorder had captured enough. Vincent had said enough. Names, payments, Clara, Thomas, all of it. She only needed to stay alive long enough for the truth to leave the building with her. Then a steel security door slammed down at the end of the corridor. She stopped. On the other side of the wired glass, Dante appeared. For 1 second, Evelyn and Dante only stared at each other through the scratched pane. His face changed when he saw her. Not because she was hurt, not yet. Because she was alive, and terrified, and still standing. And Dante could not move. The first time he had frozen, it was because he saw her beside Gabriel and realized she might no longer be his to lose. This time he froze because the truth finally caught him. Every rejection, every lie, every warning dressed as protection. Every time he decided for her instead of standing with her, all of it had brought them here, to a locked door in a dead warehouse, with Evelyn on the wrong side of danger. Evelyn slammed her palm against the glass. Dante, his eyes focused. Move, she said, and he did. Dante and Gabriel hit the door together once, twice, the frame cracked. A third strike tore the old lock loose, and Evelyn fell forward as Dante pulled the door open. Caught her, but only for a second before she stepped back on her own feet. I have the recording, she said, breathless, and the notebook. Gabriel almost smiled. Of course you do. Vincent emerged from the shadows with 2 men behind him and a gun in his hand. Touching, he said. The boss, the lawyer, and the woman who thinks paper can stop blood. Dante stepped forward, but Evelyn grabbed his sleeve. No, she said. Not like this. Sirens sounded in the distance. Gabriel lifted his phone. Mercer has everything. So do 3 other people. It's over, Vincent. Vincent looked at Dante. Your father would have ended this with blood. Dante's hand tightened, then lowered. My father called violence strength, he said, because he never had the discipline for justice. By the time federal agents stormed the warehouse, Vincent Caruso was still alive, still standing, and already defeated. Evelyn sat on the curb outside with a blanket around her shoulders, while paramedics checked Gabriel's bleeding arm. Dante stood a few feet away, close enough to guard her, far enough not to claim her. Evelyn looked up at him. You saved me tonight, she said, but you still don't get to act like pain gives you ownership. Dante nodded once. For once, he understood. 6 months later, Chicago looked the same to anyone who did not know where to look. The trucks still moved before sunrises, the river still cut through the city like a dark vein. Men still made deals in restaurants with white tablecloths and no prices on the menu. But inside the Moretti organization, something old had cracked. Vincent Caruso was awaiting trial, and for once, no one could make the evidence disappear. Evelyn S. recordings, Thomas Hart's notebook, Clarabelle S. technical report, and Gabriel's legal files had built a wall too high for even the old guard to climb over. The papers did what bullets never could. Made the truth official. Dante Moretti lost more than anyone said out loud. Several shell companies were shut down. Contracts were surrendered. Old allies vanished when they realized he would no longer protect them from consequences. Men who had once feared him began testing the edges of his power. There were whispers that he had gone soft, that the Hart woman had changed him, that Gabriel Rossi had turned him into a lawyer-esque version of a boss. Dante heard the whispers. He did not answer them. For most of his life, he had mistaken silence for strength. Now he was learning that sometimes strength meant letting people talk while you did the harder thing anyway. Gabriel left his private role inside the Moretti organization and opened a small legal firm near the courthouse. On the door, beneath his name, were the words, whistleblower protection, pension fraud, labor rights. Evelyn laughed the first time she saw it because it sounded almost too honest for a man who had spent half his career walking through shadows. Gabriel smiled and said, "I am trying something dangerous," she asked. What that was, he said, being useful in daylight. Evelyn worked with him on certain cases, but never for him that distinction mattered. She had learned the hard way that even kindness could become a cage if a person forgot to stand on her own feet. Gabriel understood. Dante was learning. The memorial for Thomas Hart and Clara Bell was held in the same small church where Dante had once met Evelyn S. father in secret. There were no cameras, no politicians, no speeches polished until they lost their soul. Evelyn stood at the front and spoke about her father as a man, not a symbol, she said. Thomas Hart had been afraid, and then she paused long enough for the room to understand that fear did not erase courage. He was afraid, she said, and he still tried to do the right thing. That is the kind of brave most people never see. Dante stood in the back row. He did not sit with the family. He did not claim grief that was not his to own. Evelyn spoke Clara's name, his head lowered, but he did not hide. For the first time in years, Clara was not only a wound inside him, she was a woman people remembered for what she had done, not just how she had died. After the service, Gabriel found Dante on the church steps. The afternoon was cold, the sky pale, the city loud in the distance. "I hated seeing her with you," Dante said. Gabriel looked at him. "I know." Dante nodded once. "But you were good to her. She deserved someone to be good to her while you were busy being afraid." A year ago, that sentence might have started a war. Now Dante only accepted it. "Thank you," he said. Gabriel studied him for a moment, then gave a small smile. "Next time you love someone, try telling her before she has to date your best friend to find out." Dante almost smiled back. Almost. Later that evening, Evelyn found him waiting outside her office. No guards, no black car at the curb, no expensive flowers. Just Dante, standing under the streetlight like a man instead of a kingdom. "Dinner," he said. "Not because you owe me, not because I saved you, not because I'm sorry. Just dinner if you want it." Evelyn folded her arms. "Any secrets I should know before dessert?" Dante handed her a thin envelope. Inside was a list of open investigations, legal risks, remaining threats, and unfinished business tied to the old organization. "No secrets," he said, "just unfinished work." She read the pages slowly. She folded them and looked at him for a long moment. "One dinner," she said, "and if you lie to me, it's the last." Dante nodded. "One dinner is more than I deserve." "Good," Evelyn said. Then Dante waste it. They walked to a small neighborhood restaurant Dante did not own. At the door, he stepped ahead and opened it for her. But he did not touch her back. He did not guide her in. He did not move her like something that belonged to him. He simply stood aside, and this time Evelyn chose to walk through. The first time Dante Moretti saw her with his best friend, he could not move, but love was never proven by the man who froze because he was afraid to lose her. It was proven by the man who finally moved when he understood she had never belonged to him at all. Literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
At its heart, this story is not only about a mafia boss, a woman he loved, and the best friend who stood beside her when he would not. It is about something much deeper, the difference between love and control, between protection and possession, between silence and truth. Dante Moretti believed he was protecting Evelyn Hart by rejecting her. He had seen what happened when love entered his dangerous world. He had lost Clara. He had carried guilt for years. So, when Evelyn came close to him, he pushed her away again and again. In his mind, every rejection was an act of sacrifice. He told himself she would be safer without him. But the painful truth is this: when we make decisions for another person without giving them the truth, we are not protecting them. We are taking away their right to choose. That is one of the strongest lessons in this story. Good intentions do not always create good actions. A person can love you and still hurt you. A person can care about you and still be wrong in the way they show it. Dante was not evil for wanting Evelyn safe, but he was wrong to hide the truth from her, wrong to treat her like a fragile thing, and wrong to believe that his fear gave him authority over her life. Evelyn's journey teaches another powerful lesson. Self-respect must be stronger than longing. She loved Dante. She saw the good in him when most people only saw power and danger, but she refused to lose herself waiting for a man who kept closing the door. When she chose to step away, it was not revenge. It was dignity. It was the quiet strength of a woman who finally understood that love should not require her to beg for honesty. Gabriel's role also carries an important moral message. He shows us that loyalty is not blind obedience. True loyalty does not mean agreeing with someone when they are wrong. True loyalty means having the courage to tell the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. Gabriel remained Dante's friend, but he also protected Evelyn's right to be treated with respect. That is the kind of loyalty that helps people grow instead of keeping them trapped in their mistakes. Vincent, the villain, represents the old belief that power comes from fear, secrets, and violence. But the ending proves the opposite. Real strength is not revenge. Real strength is discipline. Dante could have killed Vincent, but he chose justice instead. That choice showed that he had finally begun to change. The deepest message of this story is simple but powerful. Love is not ownership. Love does not control, silence, or decide for another person. Love tells the truth. Love respects choice. Love allows the other person to stand freely, even when that freedom might lead them away. And perhaps that is why Dante's final act matters so much. He does not pull Evelyn through the door. He opens it, steps aside, and lets her choose. That is when he finally becomes worthy of a second chance. Not because he loved her, but because he finally learned how to respect her.